On August 19, 1990, a man named Stephen Smith died in a Manhattan apartment with a view of Central Park. He was 62. Lung cancer had been eating through him for over a year, and by the end he weighed less than 100 pounds. His wife had been at his side for 34 years of marriage, through 9 presidential campaigns, 4 children, 2 assassinations, and a family scandal so large it needed its own team of lawyers on permanent retainer. She buried him quietly. No press conference, no tell-all. Just a funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral, the same church where they'd been married in 1956, and then she went back to her apartment and kept living. That should have been the end of the story. A long marriage, a sad but ordinary death, a widow who grieved in private. Except 9 months later, a national magazine ran a cover story that blew the whole thing open. The headline accused her late husband of running around on her for decades. It described her as a woman who'd been treated, in the magazine's own word, like dirt. It claimed she'd had a brief affair of her own out of loneliness. It painted her children as kids raised by boarding schools and nannies while both their parents were somewhere else. She wrote back. Not through a publicist, herself, in a letter printed in the same magazine, and she used the word horrified. She called the story demeaning to her children, to her entire family. She said everyone who actually knew her husband held him in nothing but respect. So which version is true? The quiet widow who mourned a good marriage, or the woman putting on a brave face for a magazine after 34 years of being humiliated in private? That question sat unresolved for decades, mostly because the woman at the center of it refused to talk about her marriage again for the rest of her life. She gave interviews about Ireland, about her disability foundation, about her brothers. She never once sat down and explained what actually happened between her and Stephen Smith. To understand why that question matters, you have to understand what marriage meant in this particular family. Because in the Kennedy family, a wedding was never really a private event. It was closer to a corporate acquisition. You weren't just marrying a man. You were marrying a campaign apparatus, a press operation, a compound in Hyannisport with assigned seating at every meal, and a mother-in-law who kept a card file tracking which grandchildren had sent thank you notes on time. And almost none of the women who signed up for that arrangement got out unscathed. Start with Rose Kennedy herself, the matriarch, the woman who built the whole machine. She spent decades of her marriage watching her husband Joseph conduct affairs so openly that one of his mistresses, the actress Gloria Swanson, once sat at the family dinner table while Rose poured the tea. Rose's answer to that humiliation was to leave the country for months at a time, to bury herself in the Catholic Church, and to never, not once, discuss it publicly. She survived her marriage. She did not enjoy it. Then there's Ethel Kennedy, who married Robert. 11 children, a marriage that by most accounts was genuinely happy, and then a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles in June of 1968. And Ethel is a 39-year-old widow, pregnant with her 11th child, watching the man she loved get buried on television. Jacqueline Kennedy's marriage to the president is the most picked over of all of them. Camelot on the surface, and underneath it, affairs that were common knowledge inside the White House press corps and never printed, because that's simply what the arrangement was in 1962. And then Dallas. She was 34 when she became the most famous widow in the world. Joan Kennedy married Ted, and her marriage became something closer to a slow-motion collapse in front of cameras. The drinking, the very public infidelities, a car accident on a bridge in Chappaquiddick that killed a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne and effectively ended any hope of trust between them. Joan and Ted divorced in 1982, after 24 years, and Joan spent the back half of her life battling alcoholism largely alone. Patricia Kennedy married the actor Peter Lawford, and that marriage folded under the weight of his own addictions. They divorced in 1966. Eunice Kennedy's marriage to Sergeant Shriver held together on paper for 56 years, but even that one carried its own private strain, documented later by their children, around his political ambitions and her demanding schedule running the foundation that would eventually become the Special Olympics. Do you see the shape of this? 9 Kennedy siblings. Look at the wives and husbands who married into this family, and the pattern isn't subtle. assassination, divorce, addiction, public humiliation, death by scandal, car crash, cancer, or heartbreak. Being a Kennedy spouse was, statistically, one of the worst jobs in 20th century American public life. Jean Kennedy was the youngest daughter, eighth of 9 children, quiet, by every account, the sibling who didn't run for office, didn't give the fiery speeches, didn't end up as a tabloid fixture the way Ted or Jackie did, and in 1956, at 28 years old, she married a Brooklyn-born financial strategist named Stephen Smith, and their marriage lasted 34 years, until his death, and by the surface accounting, it survived. No divorce, no public scandal while he was alive, no headline-grabbing tragedy that split them apart before their time was up. But here's what makes this story worth 45 minutes of your evening. The marriage that looks the most intact from the outside might be the one where the truth is hardest to actually see. Stephen Smith wasn't some minor figure who stayed out of the spotlight because he had nothing to hide. He was the man who managed the family's entire fortune. He ran 3 presidential campaigns for 3 different brothers. He was, by the accounts of people who worked closest to the Kennedys, one of the most powerful men in that family who never once ran for office himself. A man with that much power, that much access to money, and that much practice managing other people's secrets is exactly the kind of man who's good at managing his own. So, over the next hour, we're going to walk through this marriage from the wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral to the funeral at the same altar 34 years later, and then past it, into the 30 years Jean lived on her own and turned into arguably the most consequential chapter of her life. We're going to look at what the family said about it, what outsiders reported, and what Jean herself was willing to admit, on the rare occasions she said anything at all. And we're going to ask the question that magazine article raised, and never fully answered. Did Jean Kennedy actually have a good marriage, or did she just have the discipline to make a bad one look good for 3.5 decades? Before we get into how this marriage actually started, hit subscribe if you're into these deep dives on the women who married into American dynasties and lived to tell, or not tell, the real story. We've got a whole series on the Kennedy in-laws going up over the next few weeks, and this is one of the harder ones to untangle. All right, let's go back to 1956. Act 1. The wedding nobody expected to last. Jean Ann Kennedy was born February 20th, 1928, in Boston, the second youngest of Joseph and Rose Kennedy's 9 children. She grew up in the shadow of louder siblings. Joe Jr. was the golden son being groomed for the presidency before he was killed flying a bombing mission in 1944. Jack was already a war hero and a congressman by the time Jean was in her 20s. Kathleen, the sister the family called Kick, died in a plane crash in 1948 when Jean was 20. Being a Kennedy in the 1940s meant watching your family absorb tragedy at a pace most families never experience in a lifetime, and Jean absorbed all of it before she'd even finished college. She went to Manhattanville College, a Catholic school outside New York City, where she studied English and became close friends with 2 women who would later become her sisters-in-law, Ethel Skakel, who would marry Robert, and Joan Bennett, who would marry Ted. The 3 of them were friends first, family later. That detail matters, because it means Jean watched Ethel's and Joan's marriages unfold, not as a distant relative, but as someone who'd known both women since they were 20 years old, before any of them had the faintest idea what marrying into this family would actually cost. Stephen Edward Smith came from a completely different world, born September 24, 1927, in Bayport on Long Island, and raised in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, the youngest of 5 brothers in a prosperous Irish Catholic family, whose business, Cleary Brothers Inc., ran tugboats and barges on New York's upstate canals and in New York Harbor. Not Kennedy money, working money, even if it was comfortable working money. He went to Georgetown, graduating in 1948 with a degree in history, then served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War from 1951 to 1952. By the mid-1950s, he was building a career as a financial analyst in Manhattan. He wasn't political yet. He wasn't famous yet. Family accounts describe him meeting Jean through her sister Patricia's social circle. He was just a sharp, disciplined young man from a Brooklyn maritime family who happened to fall in with the Kennedys' orbit. They married on May 19, 1956, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Jean was 28. It wasn't the biggest Kennedy wedding. That distinction belonged to Jack and Jackie's wedding 2 years earlier, an event so large it needed police to manage the crowds. But it was a real merger of two families who, on paper, had almost nothing in common. A Brooklyn tugboat family and the most politically ambitious clan in America. What happened next tells you everything about how the Kennedys operated. Within 4 years, Stephen Smith wasn't just Jean's husband. He was the political advisor and finance chairman for John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign. He didn't marry into a family. He married into a job, the most important behind-the-scenes job in American electoral politics for the next 2 decades. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had a habit of testing the men who married his daughters, looking for who had the stomach and the discipline to actually run things. Peter Lawford, who married Patricia, didn't pass that test. He stayed a Hollywood actor on the family's social periphery. Stephen Smith passed. He passed so completely that by 1961, after Joseph Sr. suffered a debilitating stroke on December 19 of that year, it was Stephen who took over managing the entire Kennedy family fortune, stepping into the role of chairman and chief executive of the family's holding entity, operating out of the Park Agency's offices at 200 Park Avenue in Manhattan, with control over investments that by the mid-1970s were estimated at somewhere between $300 and $500 million, real estate, securities, and the remaining pieces of the commodities, film and liquor importing empire Joseph Sr. had built decades earlier, including the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, one of the largest commercial buildings in the world. Think about what that meant for Jean's marriage. She hadn't just married a man, she'd married the family's chief financial officer, its top campaign strategist, and eventually its de facto patriarch, once Joseph Sr.'s stroke left him unable to speak. Every one of her brother's political careers ran through her husband's office. Every dollar the family had access to ran through her husband's ledgers. That's an enormous amount of power to hand one man, and an enormous amount of trust for one wife to extend, especially a wife who watched, up close, what that kind of power did to the men who held it. And it's worth pausing on what kind of man Stephen Smith actually was in that office, because it matters for what comes later. People who dealt with him professionally didn't describe a smooth political operator with an easy smile. They described someone tough, aggressive, sometimes outright abrasive, a man who negotiated hard and didn't apologize for it. When the 3 Kennedy presidential campaigns he ran left behind unpaid bills, Smith was the one who dealt with the creditors, and by some accounts he offered them as little as 20 cents on the dollar to settle what was owed, with the rate only getting worse the longer a vendor waited to take the deal. That's not the profile of a man who needed anyone's approval. That's the profile of a man who was comfortable making other people absorb the cost of his family's ambitions. Keep that in mind, because a husband who operates that way in a boardroom is not automatically a different person at home. Act 2. Running the family through the worst years of the century. Quick pause before we get into the campaigns and the assassinations. If you're finding this rundown useful, drop a comment telling me which Kennedy wife's story you want covered next. I read every one of them, and the next video in this series gets picked partly from what shows up down there. Now, back to 1960. Stephen Smith ran Jack Kennedy's 1960 campaign finances and strategy. He was in the room for decisions that shaped the closest presidential election of the 20th century, and through all of it, Jean campaigned too. She wasn't a background figure at home with the children while her husband worked. She traveled the country for her brother, gave speeches, worked crowds, did the retail politics that the Kennedy sisters were expected to do. In 1963, when Jackie Kennedy was traveling and unable to host, it was Jean who stepped in to co-host a state dinner for the President of Ireland. Later that year, she accompanied her brother on his famous trip to Ireland, a trip she would later call one of the most moving experiences of her life, and one that would matter enormously to her own life 3 decades later. Then November 22, 1963, and everything changed. Jean was 35 years old when her brother, the President of the United States, was assassinated in Dallas. Her husband had run his campaigns, and by most accounts was already serving as the operational head of what would have been Jack's 1964 re-election effort. Her sister-in-law was suddenly the most famous widow on earth, and the family didn't get time to grieve as individuals. They were expected, immediately, to function as an institution. Stephen Smith was one of the men who helped manage the funeral arrangements and the family's affairs in the days after, and in the years that followed, he became chairman of the corporation responsible for building the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, turning his brother-in-law's memory into a physical institution, the same way he'd once turned his brother-in-law's ambition into a campaign. Jean, like all her siblings, had to grieve in public while performing composure for a nation watching. 5 years later, in 1968, Stephen Smith ran Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. This is worth sitting with. The same man who managed the family's money was now running his second brother-in-law's run for president, at a moment when the country was in open chaos over Vietnam and civil rights. And then, in June, in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, Robert Kennedy was shot too. Stephen Smith was there. He had built the campaign, and now he had to help unwind it in the space of a single terrible night. Jean lost her second brother to an assassin in 5 years. Her husband had been standing inside both campaigns when the men leading them were killed. By any reasonable measure, this is enough trauma to break a marriage. Some marriages in this family did break under exactly this kind of weight. Joan and Ted's marriage cracked open partly under the pressure of Ted trying to fill the void left by 2 dead brothers, drinking heavily, and eventually, in 1969, driving off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island with a young campaign worker named Mary Jo Kopechny in the car. She drowned. Ted didn't report the accident for roughly 10 hours. It became one of the defining scandals of the family's history, and it poisoned his marriage to Joan for good, even though the divorce didn't come until 1982. Jean and Stephen didn't have a Chappaquiddick. There's no single catastrophic public event in their marriage that historians point to as the moment it broke, and that absence is exactly why the People magazine story, when it eventually ran, felt so jarring to people who thought they understood this couple. Because the other Kennedy marriages that failed loudly, in ways the public could see happening in real time. If Jean and Stephen's marriage was failing too, it was failing in total silence, behind the walls of a Manhattan apartment, and a family famous for controlling its own narrative. In 1979, Stephen took on one more campaign, Ted's ill-fated run against Jimmy Carter for the 1980 Democratic nomination, launched that fall when polling suggested Kennedy could beat a weakened incumbent president. It lost, badly, and Ted chose not to run again. It was, by most accounts, the last major campaign Stephen would run. He was in his early 50s by then, and the toll of 3 decades managing this family's money, its image and its political ambitions was visible to the people who worked around him. 4 campaigns, 1 assassinated president, 1 assassinated senator, 1 bruising primary defeat, and 3 decades of a family fortune that never stopped needing a steward. That is, quite simply, an enormous amount of institutional weight for one household to carry, and Jean carried the domestic side of it in near-total public silence, while her husband carried the financial and political side of it in rooms she was rarely part of. Act 3. The illness, the silence, and the magazine story. Stephen Smith was a heavy smoker for most of his adult life. By the late 1980s, that habit caught up with him. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and the disease took him slowly, over roughly a year, before he died at home in Manhattan on August 19, 1990, at 62 years old. For 34 years, Jean had been married to a man who, by external appearance, never left her, never divorced her, never handed her the kind of public humiliation that Joan or Rose had to absorb. When Senator Edward Kennedy spoke at the dedication of a center named for Stephen at the JFK Library the following year, he called him his future wife's husband of 34 years, framing the marriage in exactly the terms Jean herself would have wanted: long, loyal, intact. And then, 9 months after the funeral, in the spring of 1991, People magazine printed a story that punctured that framing entirely. The article claimed that behind the closed doors of that apartment, the marriage had been something closer to an arrangement than a partnership. It alleged Stephen had a pattern of affairs going back years. It used the phrase, like dirt, to describe how he treated her. It claimed Jean herself had a brief affair of her own, born out of the isolation of a marriage, where her husband was rarely home and rarely faithful when he was. It described the 4 Smith children, William, Stephen Jr., Amanda, and Kim, as having grown up largely raised by boarding schools rather than by 2 present parents. Jean's response was immediate and personal. She wrote the letter herself. She called the piece demeaning, not just to her but to her children and to the entire family. And she said everyone who actually knew her husband held him in nothing but respect and admiration. Her son, Stephen Smith Jr., went further, publicly calling the profile profoundly upsetting to his recently widowed mother and disputing its accuracy. Here's the problem with evaluating a moment like that from the outside, decades later. You're looking at 2 competing claims, and neither side is a neutral witness. A magazine chasing a sensational cover story about a powerful, secretive family has every incentive to make the story juicier than the full truth might actually support. A grieving widow defending her 34-year marriage and her 4 children's childhood has every incentive to deny anything that complicates the picture, whether or not the denial is entirely accurate. Somewhere between an aggressive tabloid narrative and a family's practiced instinct for damage control sits whatever actually happened in that marriage, and Jean took that answer to her grave. What we can say, from the documented pattern of Stephen Smith's life, is that he was a man who spent his career managing other people's secrets for a living. He kept the Kennedy family's finances private for 30 years. He kept campaign strategy confidential across 3 presidential runs. He was, by his own colleagues' accounts, comfortable being the tough, unsentimental operator who made hard calls other people didn't want to make. A man that's skilled at controlling information professionally, and that comfortable absorbing other people's disapproval, would have had every tool he needed to control his own story too, if there was something to control. That doesn't prove the people's story was true. It simply means Jean, of all people, would have had a husband uniquely equipped to keep things from her, or to help her keep things from everyone else. It's also worth asking why the magazine waited until after Stephen was dead. A living Stephen Smith, with 3 decades of experience burying stories that threatened this family, would have been a formidable subject to report on. A dead one couldn't sue, couldn't deny anything in his own voice, couldn't call his own lawyers. Whether that timing reflects a source who only felt safe talking once he was gone, or a publication that knew the story was safer to print once its central figure couldn't fight back, is exactly the kind of ambiguity that makes this marriage so hard to pin down, almost 35 years later. Act 4. What she did with the 30 years she had left. If Jean's marriage was complicated, what she built afterward was not ambiguous at all. In 1993, 3 years after Stephen's death, President Bill Clinton nominated her as United States Ambassador to Ireland, making her and her father, Joseph Sr., who had served as ambassador to the United Kingdom decades earlier, the first father and daughter pair to both hold U.S. ambassadorships. She was 65 years old, with no formal diplomatic background, and during her confirmation hearing she pointed back to that 1963 trip with her brother as one of the most moving experiences of her life. She would later say, only half joking, that next to the presidency itself, ambassador to Ireland was one of the best jobs an Irish American could hold. She served in Dublin from June 1993 to September 1998, and it was not a ceremonial posting. Northern Ireland was still deep in the Troubles when she arrived, and in September 1993, the Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams and the moderate nationalist John Hume issued a joint statement outlining what became known as the Hume-Adams Initiative, an attempt to build a framework for peace. The next crucial step, everyone involved understood, was whether the United States would grant Adams a visa to visit, something Washington had refused since the Troubles began in 1969, on the grounds that Adams was tied to a terrorist organization. Jean threw herself into that question. She had already built a relationship with Hume through her brother Ted, and in Dublin she grew close to Father Alec Reid, a priest who had spent years quietly working the peace channels between the IRA and the British government. Before she made any decision, She consulted Ireland's Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, who favoured granting the visa. Then she consulted her brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, who backed her too, alongside Democratic Senate colleagues Chris Dodd, John Kerry, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Hume came around as well. With that support behind her, Jean sent a cable to Washington recommending the visa be approved. The British government fought her on it with everything they had. The British ambassador to the US, Sir Robin Renwick, ran what amounted to a round-the-clock campaign to block the visa, and he found powerful allies inside Jean's own government. House Speaker Tom Foley, Attorney General Janet Reno, and FBI Director Louis Freeh all argued against it. Inside Jean's own embassy staff, some officials disagreed with her position strongly enough to send a dissenting cable of their own to the State Department, undercutting their ambassador's recommendation. Jean's response was not diplomatic hand-wringing. She removed the dissenting staff from the process, a decision aggressive enough that she was later formally reprimanded by Secretary of State Warren Christopher for how she handled it. That's not a footnote you'd expect from the quiet, background Kennedy sister who avoided the spotlight her whole life. It's the same instinct her husband had shown for decades in boardrooms and campaign war rooms. When you believe you're right, you clear the room of people who disagree with you, and you make the call anyway. In January 1994, Adams applied for the visa again, this time presenting himself directly at the US Embassy in Dublin rather than the consulate in Belfast, forcing the decision through Jean's office specifically. She and Father Reid reportedly sat up through the night, waiting for word back from Washington. With President Clinton weighing a campaign promise to engage Sinn Féin against the special relationship with Britain, and with Irish America's political weight pushing hard in Jean's direction, Clinton ultimately sided with his ambassador. Adams got his visa. He travelled to the United States in February 1994 to make the case for a ceasefire directly to the American public and to Irish-American power brokers. And later that year, in August 1994, the IRA declared a cessation of violence. Jean also played a role in securing a similar visa for another Republican figure, Joe Cahill, whose support was considered essential to selling the ceasefire to the IRA's rank and file. Historians of the peace process don't treat this as a minor diplomatic footnote. It's widely regarded as one of the pivotal steps on the road to the Good Friday Agreement, the 1998 Accord, that formally ended 30 years of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, an agreement Jean stepped down as ambassador shortly after seeing signed. Gerry Adams himself, decades later, remembered her as a wonderful woman with a mind of her own, down to earth, straightforward. Someone who stood against her own officials' objections because she believed Republicans were genuinely trying to find a democratic way forward. Bertie Ahern, the former Irish Taoiseach, called her gutsy and said she didn't suffer fools easily. In 1998, the year she left her post, Irish President Mary McAleese conferred honorary Irish citizenship on her in recognition of that work, an honour reserved for a small number of people judged to have rendered exceptional service to the nation. Sit with the contrast for a second. This is a woman who, throughout 34 years of marriage, apparently never contradicted her husband publicly, never leaked a word about what happened behind their apartment door, and let a magazine's accusations stand largely unanswered beyond one formal letter. And 3 years after that husband died, she was defying the British Foreign Office, her own State Department superiors, and the FBI director, on a decision with the fate of a peace process hanging on it. That is not the profile of a woman who lacked spine. It's the profile of a woman who had spent 3.5 decades choosing, very deliberately, which battles were worth fighting in public, and her marriage, evidently, was never going to be one of them. Ireland wasn't the only thing she built in those 30 years. Starting in 1974, well before Stephen's death, Jean had already founded Very Special Arts, an organisation designed to give children and adults with disabilities access to arts education, theatre, music, painting, dance, at a moment when disabled children were still routinely excluded from mainstream arts programs in American schools. It would later be folded into the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts as VSA, and it became one of the largest arts and disability programs in the world, operating in dozens of countries. That work was deeply personal. Jean's oldest surviving sister, Rosemary, had been mildly intellectually disabled from birth and was left permanently and severely impaired after Joseph Sr. arranged for her to undergo a lobotomy in 1941, a decision made without Rose's knowledge, and one the family did not discuss publicly for decades. Jean was also, starting in 1964, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, the family's disability-focused philanthropy, and remained connected to it for the rest of her life, turning a private family tragedy into one of the more consequential grassroots disability arts movements of the 20th century, well before that kind of advocacy carried any particular social cachet. She was, in other words, building an independent public legacy for years before Stephen died, which complicates any simple story about a woman who spent 34 years overshadowed by a powerful husband and then finally found herself once he was gone. The truth seems to be closer to this. Jean always had her own ambitions and her own convictions, running in parallel to her marriage rather than suppressed by it. And it was only after 1990 that the wider world got to see how forceful those convictions actually were, unfiltered by a husband who preferred operating in the shadows. She outlived nearly everyone: her parents, 7 of her 8 siblings, her husband, and countless nieces and nephews, touched by the various tragedies that ran through this family for 100 years. When she died on June 17, 2020, at 92, she was the last surviving child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, the final person alive who remembered this family before any of the assassinations, before Chappaquiddick, before the divorces and the addictions and the magazine covers. Her daughter Kim told reporters simply that she had lived an amazing life. Her niece Maria Shriver called her an extraordinary woman. She had watched literally every version of what could go wrong for a Kennedy wife, sitting across the dinner table from most of the women it happened to, and she still went ahead and built her own marriage inside that same machine. Act 5. So what actually happened in that apartment? Let's put the pieces on the table honestly, because a story like this deserves more than a tidy bow at the end. On one side, a 34-year marriage with no divorce, no public scandal during Stephen's lifetime, 4 children raised to adulthood, and a widow who, by every account from people who actually knew the couple, was devastated by his death and furious at how the magazine characterized it. Ted Kennedy's own eulogy described a loyal, intact partnership, and the family closed ranks around that version, with a unity that, in a family this fractured by public scandal elsewhere, is itself worth noting. On the other side, a husband whose entire professional life was built on the skill of controlling information and managing other people's problems without letting the mess become visible. A magazine investigation detailed enough to name specific allegations rather than vague innuendo. And a wife whose response, while forceful, was also brief. 1 letter, then total silence on the subject for the next 29 years of her life, even as she gave interviews on nearly everything else. People who have nothing to hide sometimes still choose silence because grief is private. But people who do have something to hide also choose silence for exactly the same stated reason, and from the outside the two are indistinguishable. What we don't have, and will probably never have, is Jean's own unfiltered account. She didn't write a memoir that dealt with her marriage directly. She didn't sit for the kind of long-form interview where a skilled journalist might have pressed her on specifics. The closest thing we have to her voice on the subject is that one letter from 1991, written in the heat of grief and public embarrassment, which makes it a genuine record of how she wanted the story told, but not necessarily a complete record of what actually happened. So did Jean Kennedy's marriage actually survive what destroyed every other Kennedy wife's marriage, or did she just have 30 years, after Stephen died, to control how the story got told? Maybe both things are true at once. Maybe a marriage can be genuinely stable and still hide the exact same fractures that broke apart every marriage around it, just managed better, by 2 people who'd spent their whole adult lives managing other people's secrets for a living. A man who negotiated Kennedy campaign debts down to 20 cents on the dollar, and a woman who faced down the British Foreign Office over a visa, were, whatever else they were, both extremely good at getting the outcome they wanted, while giving up as little information as possible along the way. It would be strange if that particular skill set only showed up in their public lives, and never once in their private one. If you want the rest of this family's story, Rosemary's Roses, the sister-in-law who watched all of it happen from 3 feet away for 70 years, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering the whole family, one marriage at a time, and this is the one nobody else has actually told straight. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next